The Communist Manifesto is one of the most important political documents in history. It changed the 20th century forever in ways that you can't even imagine, and it's going to continue to change the political landscape around the world for years to come. But more on that in a moment. Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley. You are listening to Biocast Addendum, where we make sense of the chaotic past. In this episode, we're going to be exploring the ideas and concepts laid out by Karl Marx himself in the Communist Manifesto. I think this is a really important document to study, not to become a communist, but to understand where communist thinking comes from, and because with that you can see where they go. What do communists think? Well, it all goes back to Karl Marx and the ideas he put forth in this book. Now, I will leave a link to this on Amazon, but you can read it online for free. I strongly encourage you guys to check it out by yourself after watching this presentation. Maybe, you might see something that I missed. So there's just so much information in this little pamphlet, really, that is just so important to go over. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. So this was originally published as a political pamphlet back in 1848, as revolutions were really starting to spread across Europe. You see, what had happened was there was the American Revolution in the 1770s, and a lot of people took inspiration from that. And one of the first European nations to take that inspiration, really put it into practice, were the French. And then now this is, after the French Revolution had occurred and turned into that dumpster fire that led to Napoleon rising to power. And now this is where everyone else in Europe is kind of like, oh wow, maybe we can have a revolution too. And that's kind of what was going on. So this pamphlet was written by Marx and Engels. They were two very good friends, and I'll probably do a presentation on just these two guys and their relationship, and because they're just such crazy thinkers that you just there's so much that you can do on just these two guys alone. Now, the first sentence in the Communist Manifesto really sets the scene for the ideas that's going to be laid forth going throughout. Quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Now, what did Karl Marx exactly mean when he wrote this? Now, it takes a long time to really get a good understanding of Marx, but he broke society down into two classes of people. There were the oppressors, and there were the oppressed. Now, he actually stems his philosophy off of Hegel's dialectic, right? The Hegelian dialectic, and he applies that philosophy, that mental model, to economics. So I'm going to assume that you don't know what a Hegelian dialectic is because it's kind of a random thing, right? Now, it's pretty simple, right? So there are three parts, three basic simple parts. Now, the first part is the thesis. This is how things are naturally, right? This is just the way things are right now. Then there's the antithesis. This is the change or the revolution that goes on. And then there's the third part, the synthesis. This is the new way things are. So if we were going to apply this to the way the Soviet Union had formed, we would say the thesis was the Russian Tsarist regime, right? So then there was the antithesis, the communist agitators, the October Revolution, and then the new synthesis, that third part, was the Soviet Union. So Karl Marx believed that this Hegelian dialectic applied to everything, but especially economics. And that's really important to understand. He looked back at the past, and he saw constant economic struggle in every civilization, in every society. Everything he could ever read about. I mean, going back to Roman times, there were literal slaves, and then there were the Roman elites. And then you had medieval times where most people were feudal serfs. Now, being a serf was a little bit better than being a slave, but I mean, in practice, you were basically a slave anyway. You worked land you didn't own. You were technically someone else's property. And then there were the small a number of rulers at the top of civilization, basically collecting all the wealth that everyone else created. And if Marx were alive today, he would no doubt say that, yeah, this is in practice right now. There are the rich people who control society and government and politics and banking and everything else. They're at the top. And then the rest of the people in society, people like you, people like me, we are the oppressed. That's how Karl Marx would see it. So that's kind of getting an understanding of what this first sentence is laying out here and some of Karl Marx's philosophy behind it all. So one of the things he talks about in the Communist Manifesto is the idea that the bourgeoisie, they were the ones that were leading a lot of these revolutions going on in Europe, right? So a bourgeoisie revolution is different from a communist revolution. So to understand this difference, let's look at the 1905 revolution in Russia. So I've recently done a whole lot of content on the Russian Revolution, especially with Leon Trotsky. And in 1905, that was their first revolution where the Tsar and feudal society basically gets thrown out of civilization. Right? They just get thrown out, tossed out like the trash. The Tsar has to go into exile, and basically the people get to do what they want. Now, the important thing to note is that the new people who are stepping up to control politics, to control the government, these are rich people, the bourgeoisie, the really wealthy business owners, the factory owners, the people that were born into big money. Now that's who's controlling the government, because you see, previously they weren't. They were not in control. Previously it was, the family of the Tsar, his descendants, or, if you were in England, it would have been the king and his family, and it just works out that way. It would have been the people that were religious authority, that were family of the king, people that were able to politically align themselves with the elite. But the elites were not necessarily rich. And in a bourgeoisie revolution, it's only now rich people that are controlling government, people that have grown big business. I mean, if you look at the way the American Revolution played out, Karl Marx would say that was a bourgeoisie revolution because we were freed from a king, which is a kind of a medieval thing, right? I mean, having a king, who has a king anymore? But we were freed from that. But now, well, who controls politics and the government in the United States now? Well, big business. It's Walmart, Johnson & Johnson, Anne Hathaway. It's not people like us. We technically get to vote, but again, this goes back to the whole idea that it's really about actual power, things in practice. So the bourgeoisie leads the revolution against feudal society, so they are able to control the government themselves. And he wrote about this, saying, quote, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." Now, if we look at the modern example, this is no doubt the case. And I'm coming at this, I just feel the need to say, I'm not a communist. I'm not a communist sympathizer. In fact, I'm someone that is more center-right. But I can acknowledge that this kind of thinking, there is some truth in it. The idea that the modern state, the modern government, really acts as a managing committee for the big business owners, for the bourgeoisie. Because, who are the people that don't have to pay taxes? Well, it's big business. When people like, the Walmart CEOs and again, all the big, just think about all the billionaires, right? The 1%. Those are the people that are able to put countless amounts of money into political campaigns and buying favors and closed door deals, right? Those are the things that are going on. Those are the people that really control the way the government operates. People like us, working class, ordinary people, even if we became independently wealthy, even if some of us became like a millionaire, that pales in comparison to the bourgeoisie, because we're not going to be able to influence the state on the level that the bourgeoisie, the big capitalist owners, can. And that's really important to understand, right? Because they are more concerned, the government is more concerned with maintaining the current state of things, the bourgeoisie, the GDP, right? All of these measures, they're not really concerned with anything else. Because who lines their pockets? Who pays, for them to get reelected, right? It's the bourgeoisie. It's not, the small-time political donations where everyone donates $5. That's not going to get anyone elected to office, no matter how many supporters you have. And that might be a cynical take on it, but in practice, it's kind of true. So he also has this to say, quote, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable." Now, a lot of people point out how he's very certain of himself when he writes these words. The fall of the bourgeoisie does not necessarily seem like something that's inevitable. In fact, if you look at it honestly, you could make the argument that it's inevitable that they never fall. That this new way things are, where the bourgeoisie, the rich people, they control society, that might never change. But the reason that Karl Marx believed that the fall of the bourgeoisie was inevitable was because they empowered the proletariat during the revolution. During the bourgeoisie revolution, right, where we went from a feudal society to a modern capitalist society, that was where the proletariat realized, oh, hey, I do have some power. If we all unite, we can really get some stuff done. And Karl Marx believed that with this newfound knowledge, this idea that ordinary people can change things, that is going to be how the bourgeoisie fall out of power. Now, we are about 200 years into global capitalism. The bourgeoisie is still in power. I'm not sure a lot of people feel that revolutionary spirit anymore, especially given the fall of the Soviet Union. But again, we can leave the arguments and the speculation for someone else. You can find that anywhere. I'm not doing that here. Now, another thing he talked a lot about was the global capitalism and how it expands and eventually envelops the earth. So, again, he was living in mid-1800s Germany and then eventually England, and he was really able to see firsthand what happens when a society goes from, what it was, small town economies to where everything's kind of global. Now, in the free market, you see, if it's a small geographical area, let's say it's just your feudal village, there can be a free market there. But the problem is that it's very limited. There's not a lot of competition. So whatever it is that you do, maybe you're a shoemaker. If you're even a halfway decent shoemaker, you could probably be the best one in the village, and at the very least, you're probably well paid. Now, that changes when you start introducing global capitalism, because all of a sudden now, the entire world is connected. Now you're a shoemaker, maybe you're living in London, you now have to compete with all the shoemakers in continental Europe, all the shoemakers in America, all the shoemakers in the world. I mean, you can't compete with that. You cannot compete with the entire world. It's just too difficult. And what ended up happening was the small-time artisans, the skilled craftsmen, the people that were really good, that were respected in feudal society, well, now they're thrown under the bus. No one cares about them anymore. They've been thrown under the bus. They don't matter anymore. Most of them can't even make a living doing what they're passionate about. And really now we're favoring the factory owner. Because, well, the factory owner, he can produce 100 pairs of shoes a day. They're not great shoes. They're not even good. But he can make 100 pairs of shoes a day. He can sell to the entire planet if he wants to. And that's exactly what was going on. That's still what's going on. And Karl Marx, he notes this. He talks about this in the Communist Manifesto. And he only saw the early stages of it. But if you were to look at it from the lens of today, this was an idea that, really, I think in a lot of ways it came true. So it becomes necessary and inevitable to become part of the global economy. Because your small feudal village, well, if they can get shoes for a quarter of the price now from this, from some shoemaking place in London, and let's say you're living in Germany. So you're living in Germany, you're in this small feudal village. Well, now this London shoemaker has this giant factory. He could sell to everyone in your village for like what it costs one person to buy one pair of your shoes. So all of the small-time artisans are just, again, they're completely screwed. And if you even look at it today, this is still a true fact of the way the economy operates. The skilled craftsman is not a valued member of society. And if you want to really see the way this has come true, even in modern society, just think about where you buy your shoes. Do you know some local shoemaker that, is in your town of maybe 1,500 people, and you go to this one guy, everyone just goes to this one guy, they put in an order to make a pair of shoes for them, custom, it's going to be a really high quality, really great material? No. You go to Walmart, or you go to whatever, Nike, whatever place sells shoes by the bulk. Now, with very few exceptions, this is almost universally the case. Now, again, I know there's going to be some nitpicker out there that says, oh man, I go to some local guy who makes shoes and they're really great. And there are always exceptions. But generally speaking, if I were, or any one of us, maybe it's you, were to try to become a shoemaker tomorrow, you would have a really hard time getting started. Because most people want to buy their shoes from Nike or Walmart or whatever shoe store they're fond of. And now this next line is where things get a little bit too radical. Quote, "In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend." Karl Marx wants to take your property away. Because if you have property, you are part of the bourgeoisie. Now, during his time, the wealth disparity was a little bit worse. It's pretty bad today, but it's not the worst it's ever been. But he believed that it was 9/10 of society that had no property. So if you were someone that had property, you were someone that should be targeted, that should be harassed. In bourgeois society, the past dominates the present. And basically what he means by this is that the people who were successful previously, well, those are the same people that are successful now. There's a very big divide between doing good work, doing good things, right? Being successful in the moment, really being productive, and being able to reap the benefits of that. And this eventually influences a lot of his thinking because there's this graduated income tax that he really talks a lot about because, well, it's really hard for one person to enjoy all of the wealth that they create in their lifetime. Right? Let's say you, at 20 years old, you learn a really valuable skill, you build a really great company, you make a whole bunch of money. Well, by the time you make all that money, by the time you're actually a success, well, what do you know? It's been 40 years or whatever. You're an old man now. You can't really enjoy that money. And what happens is that money that you accumulated by your hard work and labor now goes to your kids. And again, that's going to be an idea that influences him a lot down the path, later on in the Communist Manifesto. And I think this is where Karl Marx really crosses the line into, I'm not sure you can say insanity, but definitely very radical politics. Quote, "There are besides eternal truths, such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in a contradiction to all past historical experience." What Karl Marx is really saying here is that every aspect of civilization is opposed to communism. Every aspect of civilization, from morality, religion, hierarchy, anything else. And I think this is where you can really see the flaw in Marx's thinking. He doesn't just want to overturn the way things are right now. He wants to turn over the way things have always been. I mean, it's almost anti-human in some ways. I mean, he's fighting against all of human history, all of human civilization. That's what he's fighting against. And I think that this is why communist states end up in such ruin. Now, that's just my personal take on it, but he has some good ideas sprinkled throughout the Communist Manifesto. Like, he's not completely off base on some of his observations. But, I mean, stuff like this, whether he's just opposed to every aspect of civilization and just wants to turn everything on its head. Doesn't work like that, man. It doesn't work like that. So now we can go through the 10 planks of communism that Karl Marx himself lays out. So number 1 is the abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Basically, private property. It's really what he's saying there. Number 2, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Basically, the more you earn, the more the government takes. That's what Karl Marx wants. Number 3, the abolition of all rights of inheritance. So, people should not be able to get an unfair advantage because their parents were successful. Again, it goes into what I was talking about earlier, where people work really hard, they accumulate a lot of wealth, and then people who didn't earn that wealth get to benefit from it, namely their kids. Number 4, confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. So basically, if you try to leave or you try to rebel against the government, we're going to take away all your stuff. And I think this is probably one of the most dangerous planks of communism because, well, it all boils down to how do you define rebel? And again, if you look at the USSR, well, rebel was anyone that said anything bad about the Soviet Union. So you can really see where, as crazy as Karl Marx is at some of these points, he really could have worded these things a little bit better to have stopped complete nut jobs from interpreting the way it was. Right? I think if, something like this, if he had just had a slightly better thought out version, maybe it could have saved some lives. I mean, again, who knows? It's a little speculative to say one way or the other, but I don't know. Anyway, moving on. Number 5, the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So basically, the government controls the private bank and the currency. Number 6, the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Now this one is really tricky because it gets you down that rabbit hole of the government knows everything that you say, and the government controls everywhere you go. Number 7, the extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into the cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. And this is basically him just saying that the government should really be the one taking charge of the way the economy is moving forward. I mean, basically, that's what it boils down to. Number 8, equal liability of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Everyone works. Doesn't matter if you're old, young, or crippled. Everyone's working. Number 9, combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of all the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. Really lays out the idea that there should be just one entity, one communist entity. And, the abolition of all the distinction between town and country. That's really important because it really kind of lays the groundwork for some of the international thinking going forward. I mean, a lot of Marxists and communists, internationalist is kind of an interchangeable term that they use, and it has a lot to do with this 9th plank of communism. A communist wants communism in France or Korea as much as he wants it in his own country. Number 10, free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. So, I mean, at the time he was writing that, yeah, this one is actually true to some extent, even in America, where it has not necessarily been interpreted too radically. But yeah, all children get free public school, and there is basically no child labor. Kids aren't allowed to work. Not until you get 18, and then, get out there and start working kiddies. And then the combination of education with industrial production, well, I actually think that that's the one point on that 10th plank where America really differs. They don't teach anyone anything useful about any industry or production in the public educational system. So at least we're not communists on that. And then he goes through some of the failed forms of socialism and communism in the past, because as much as Karl Marx is a really important figure for communism, he's not the first. There are a lot of people who are communists before, like long before he comes around. I mean, there have been communist revolutions before him, but none of them were really large scale or significant. And none of them laid out communist thinking the way that he does. But that's going to be it for the video. Again, I strongly encourage you guys to check the Communist Manifesto out for yourselves. A link will be in the description or show notes. Thanks so much for listening all the way through. This has been Michael McCauley from Biocast Addendum, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.